I never thought of myself as the type of guy who'd cheat on his wife. Megan and I had been together for 7 years, and we had what most people would call a pretty solid marriage. We'd met in college, both of us still young, wild, and hungry for life, and our love had been explosive right from the start. We traveled together, built our careers, bought a home, and talked about starting a family soon. We shared everything: our fears, our dreams, and the quiet moments that define a relationship. But somewhere along the line, life got in the way. Our connection wasn't the same. Not bad, just different. Routine, maybe. Safe. It was during a hiking trip with a few of my old college buddies that everything changed. Megan had been busy with work, and I hadn't seen the guys in a while, so it felt like a great escape. We went up to the mountains, somewhere isolated where cell service was spotty, and the nights were long and cool. It was supposed to be a simple break from the monotony, but it became so much more than that. Her name was Amy. She was a friend of one of the guys, someone I hadn't met before. She had this carefree spirit, like she didn't have a worry in the world. She wasn't anything like Megan. Amy was spontaneous, laughing loudly at the smallest things, her eyes glimmering with mischief. The more time I spent around her, the more I found myself drawn in, like a moth to a flame. The nights around the campfire after a couple of beers, we talked. A lot. More than I'd talked to Megan in months. Maybe it was the altitude, the isolation, or the way Amy looked at me with curiosity and interest, but something happened that night that I never saw coming. One moment we were just sitting there, and the next her hand was on mine, lingering a little too long. The fire flickered in the background, and before I could stop myself, I leaned in, and she didn't pull away. I kissed her, and then it wasn't just a kiss. It was like every pent-up emotion, every moment of doubt, every little dissatisfaction I had with my life poured into that kiss. Her lips tasted like freedom, something wild and unrestrained. We snuck away from the others, deep into the woods where the moon barely peeked through the trees, and one thing led to another. In the dark, tangled in each other, I forgot about Megan. I forgot about the life I had back home. All that mattered was the thrill, the rush of adrenaline as I lost myself in Amy. It wasn't love, not even close, but it felt like something I'd been missing for a long time. The next morning, I woke up with a pit in my stomach. The guilt hit me harder than I could have imagined. I looked at Amy, still asleep beside me, and the regret was immediate. What had I done? How could I face Megan after this? The rest of the trip felt like a blur. Amy and I barely talked, the weight of what we'd done hanging over us. I knew I had to get home. I had to face Megan, even if it meant tearing everything apart. The drive back was excruciating. Every mile closer to home, I rehearsed what I'd say to Megan. Would I confess? Should I? I couldn't shake the image of her face, her smile, the way she trusted me completely. I had broken that. I had betrayed her in a way that could never be undone. When I walked through the front door, she was there, waiting for me. Her smile was warm, but something was off. There was a tension in the air that I hadn't expected. Before I could say anything, she took my hand and led me to the couch. "We need to talk," she said quietly. My heart dropped. I had planned to be the one to break the silence, to tell her what I had done. But the look in her eyes stopped me cold. She looked guilty, almost as guilty as I felt. "I've been thinking a lot while you were gone," she started, her voice trembling. "And I need to tell you something." I froze. This wasn't how I'd imagined it would go. Was she about to tell me she knew? Did she somehow find out about Amy? My mind raced, but then her next words knocked the wind out of me. "While you were away, something happened. I made a mistake." For a moment, I didn't understand. I stared at her, trying to process what she was saying, but it felt like the ground had shifted beneath my feet. "Megan? My Megan? I met someone," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "It wasn't planned, I swear, but I kissed him. It went further than that, and I'm so sorry." She broke down, tears streaming down her face, and in that moment, everything changed. All the anger, all the hurt I should have felt, it was swallowed by something else. I had no right to be angry, no right to judge. I had done the exact same thing and maybe even worse. I didn't know what to say. We sat there, staring at each other, both of us drowning in our own guilt. Megan, the woman I thought I knew better than anyone, had done the unthinkable. But then again, so had I. I don't even know where to begin, I finally said, running my hands through my hair. Because I did the same thing. Her eyes widened, and for a second, the room was completely silent. I could hear the clock ticking on the wall, feel my own heartbeat in my chest, loud and unrelenting. And then Megan let out a shaky breath, wiping the tears from her eyes. She didn't ask for details, and I didn't offer any. We sat in silence for what felt like hours, both of us lost in our own thoughts. Then Megan reached out and took my hand, gripping it tightly. "I don't know how we got here," she whispered, "but I don't want to lose you." I squeezed her hand back, the weight of what we had both done heavy between us. But in that moment, something shifted. It wasn't about betrayal anymore. It was about the two of us, standing on the edge of something fragile, something we could either destroy completely or rebuild stronger than before. "I don't want to lose you either," I admitted. We talked for hours after that, both of us confessing everything. The loneliness, the disconnect, the way life had just taken over, pushing us apart without us even realizing it. We didn't make excuses, and we didn't try to place blame. Instead, we made a choice. It wasn't easy. The weeks that followed were filled with painful conversations, moments where the weight of our actions threatened to tear us apart. But there were also moments of hope, small glimpses of the love we had once shared. We went to therapy both as a couple and individually. We had to learn how to communicate again, how to rebuild the trust we had both shattered. But slowly, we found our way back to each other. There were no grand gestures, no sudden fixes. It was a gradual process, filled with setbacks and small victories. But through it all, we chose to stay. Now, a year later, I can honestly say that we're happier than we've ever been. We've learned to appreciate each other in a way we hadn't before. Our marriage isn't perfect, but it's real. We're real. And despite everything, we're still standing. Together. In the days and weeks that followed, it was like we were walking through a minefield. Megan and I tiptoed around the house, both of us careful with our words, careful with each other's feelings. We were trying to heal, trying to move forward, but the weight of what we had done hung over us like a cloud that just wouldn't break. We had laid our cards on the table, admitted everything, but the wounds were still fresh. I remember one morning in particular. I was sitting at the kitchen table, sipping my coffee, when Megan walked in. She had dark circles under her eyes, evidence of another sleepless night. We hadn't slept well in weeks. Our bedroom felt cold, distant. Neither of us had touched each other since our confessions. The intimacy we once shared now felt foreign, like we had forgotten how to be close. "Morning," she said softly, avoiding my gaze as she poured herself a cup of coffee. "Morning," I replied, the awkwardness between us suffocating. It was these small moments that hurt the most. The everyday interactions that used to be filled with ease and love now felt strained, like we were playing a role we didn't quite remember how to play anymore. I wanted to reach out to her, to say something, anything that would make it better, but I didn't know how. Eventually, we both had to go to work, and in some ways that was a relief. Being apart, focusing on our jobs, gave us some breathing room. But I couldn't stop thinking about her, about us, and the uncertainty of whether we'd ever truly get back to what we once had. We had decided early on that we needed help. As much as we wanted to work through this on our own, it became clear that the damage we had done to each other wasn't something we could fix without guidance. So we started seeing a therapist, both together and separately. The first few sessions were brutal. Our therapist, Dr. Evans, was a calm, patient woman, but she didn't sugarcoat anything. She pushed us to talk about our feelings, to really dig into the reasons behind what had happened. There were tears, there were moments of anger, but through it all, there was a sense that we were finally facing the truth. "I think you both need to ask yourselves why you felt so disconnected," Dr. Evans said one session, looking between us. "What was missing in your marriage that led you to seek comfort outside of it?" That question hung in the air for a long time. Neither Megan nor I had a clear answer. It wasn't that we didn't love each other. We did. But somewhere along the line, we had stopped prioritizing our relationship. We had let life, the responsibilities, the routines take over, and we had drifted apart without even realizing it. Megan was the first to speak. "I guess I felt alone," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You were so focused on work, on your own life, and I didn't feel like I was part of it anymore." Her words hit me hard because they were true. I had buried myself in work, thinking that if I could just provide, if I could just be successful, everything else would fall into place. But I hadn't noticed that in doing so, I was neglecting the one person who mattered most. "I didn't see it," I admitted, guilt washing over me. "I didn't realize how much I was pushing you away." We unpacked a lot of things in those sessions. Old wounds we didn't even know existed came to the surface. Little resentments that had built up over the years, things we hadn't talked about because they seemed too small at the time, but together they had created this chasm between us. It was painful, but it was necessary. And slowly, as we continued to talk, to really listen to each other, I began to understand Megan in a way I hadn't before. And maybe, just maybe, she started to understand me too. One night, after another long therapy session, we came home exhausted. Emotionally drained, neither of us had much energy left. We sat in the living room, staring at the TV but not really watching anything. The silence between us was heavy, but it wasn't the uncomfortable silence we'd grown accustomed to. This time it felt different. It felt like we had reached some kind of breakthrough. Megan was curled up on the couch, her legs tucked beneath her, when she looked over at me. Her eyes were soft, filled with something I hadn't seen in a long time, vulnerability. "Can I ask you something?" she said quietly. "Of course," I replied, turning to face her. "Do you still find me attractive?" The question was so unexpected that I didn't know how to respond at first. I had never stopped finding her attractive. She was beautiful inside and out, but the weight of our betrayal had made it hard to express that. "Of course I do," I said after a moment. "I've always found you attractive, Megan." She bit her lip, looking down at her hands. "Then why haven't you touched me? Since everything happened, I feel like we're so far apart. I miss you." Her words hit me hard because I realized I had been avoiding her. Physically. Not because I didn't want her, but because I didn't know if it was the right time. I was afraid of making things worse, of rushing back into intimacy when we were still so fragile. But hearing her say she missed me, that broke something inside me. "I didn't want to push you," I admitted. "I wasn't sure if you were ready." She nodded slowly, her eyes meeting mine. "I'm scared too, but I think we need to try. I want to try." It was a small moment, but it felt monumental. It was the first time since the betrayal that we had really acknowledged the physical distance between us. And in that moment, I knew that this was the next step in our healing. We couldn't just talk about our feelings forever. We had to rebuild the physical connection that had once been the foundation of our love. I stood up from the couch and walked over to her, sitting down beside her. Slowly, I reached out, taking her hand in mine. Her fingers trembled slightly, but she didn't pull away. We sat there for a long time, just holding hands, letting the silence fill the space between us. It wasn't much, but it was a start. That night, we didn't rush anything. We went upstairs to our bedroom, and for the first time in weeks, we slept in the same bed. It wasn't about sex or passion, it was about closeness. I held her in my arms, feeling the warmth of her body against mine, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like we were on the same page again. The next morning, things felt different, lighter somehow. We were still far from healed, but that small step toward intimacy had shifted something between us. We were no longer tiptoeing around each other, afraid of saying the wrong thing or making the wrong move. We were starting to rebuild, brick by brick. It wasn't easy. There were still moments of doubt, moments where the memories of our betrayals would creep in and threaten to pull us apart. But every time that happened, we talked about it. We didn't hide from the pain or the guilt, we faced it head-on. And slowly, as the weeks turned into months, those moments became fewer and farther between. We started going on dates again, something we hadn't done in years. It felt strange at first, sitting across from each other in a restaurant, trying to reconnect like we were meeting for the first time. But it was also exciting. We were relearning each other, rediscovering the things that had made us fall in love in the first place. One night, after a particularly good dinner, we walked home hand in hand, the cool evening air wrapping around us. Megan looked up at me, her eyes shining with a warmth I hadn't seen in so long. "I think we're going to be okay," she said softly. I squeezed her hand, my heart swelling with hope. "Yeah," I replied. "I think we are." It's been a year now since that hiking trip, since Megan and I both made the worst mistakes of our lives. And I won't lie, it's been hard. There are still moments where I think back to Amy, where I wonder what might have been different if I hadn't kissed her that night in the mountains. But those moments are fleeting now. The guilt doesn't weigh on me the way it used to, and I think that's because we've worked so hard to rebuild what we almost lost. Megan and I are closer now than we've ever been. Our relationship isn't perfect. It never will be, but it's real. We've learned to communicate in ways we never did before. We talk about our needs, our fears, our insecurities, instead of letting them fester in silence. And most importantly, we make time for each other. No matter how busy life gets, we prioritize our marriage. We've started planning for the future again. We talk about kids, about expanding our family, and for the first time in a long time, those conversations don't feel forced. They feel natural, like we're building something together. What I've learned through all of this is that love isn't just about the big moments, the weddings, the anniversaries, the grand gestures. It's about the small, everyday choices. It's about choosing each other every single day, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. Megan and I made a choice to stay. We made a choice to fight for our marriage, to face our mistakes head on and find a way through the pain. And that's what love is, I think. It's messy, it's complicated, and it's not always easy. But it's worth it. Looking back, I'm not proud of what I did. I'll always carry that regret with me. But in a strange way, that betrayal forced us to confront the cracks in our marriage, the things we had ignored for so long. And because of that, we've come out stronger on the other side. As I sit here now, watching Megan laugh at something on TV, her eyes crinkling at the corners in that way they always do, I feel a sense of peace. We've been through hell and back, but we're still here, together, and that's all that matters. As the days turned into months, Megan and I slowly found a new rhythm. But even with all the progress we'd made, vulnerability became an essential part of our healing. Trust, we learned, wasn't something we could simply declare had returned. It was something that had to be nurtured, day by day. The hardest part was being open to the idea that we could hurt each other again. That fear never truly left, but rather than letting it drive us apart, we learned to use it as a reminder of what we valued. One evening, after dinner, we sat outside on the porch, watching the sunset. The sky was a brilliant mix of orange and pink, and the air was cool, signaling the end of summer. It was one of those peaceful moments where nothing needed to be said, where just being together was enough. Megan had her head resting on my shoulder, and for the first time in a long time, I felt completely at ease. She lifted her head and looked at me, her expression thoughtful. "Do you ever worry that, what happened? It could happen again?" Her question hung in the air, and I could see the fear in her eyes. Not just fear of me betraying her again, but also fear of her own weaknesses, the mistakes she was capable of making. "I think about it sometimes," I admitted, "but not in the way I used to. It's not about the fear anymore, it's more about the commitment. I know what's at stake now, and I don't ever want to take us for granted again." Megan nodded, her fingers tracing lazy circles on my hand. "I don't want to take us for granted either. I think that's what scares me the most, that I could slip back into old habits, and we could drift apart again." Her honesty took me by surprise, and yet, I understood exactly what she meant. Even after everything, the wounds had healed, but they'd left scars. Reminders of how fragile our relationship could be if we didn't work at it every day. I took a deep breath, choosing my words carefully. It's okay to be scared. I think it's healthy even. It keeps us honest, keeps us focused on what matters. But we can't live in fear of messing up again. All we can do is keep showing up for each other. Keep being honest, and keep choosing each other. She smiled, a small, sad smile, but there was hope in her eyes. I guess that's the only way forward, isn't it? I nodded, pulling her close again, feeling the warmth of her body against mine. Yeah, and we'll keep doing it together. The next few months felt like we were laying the groundwork for a new version of our marriage. We didn't want to go back to what we had before, because what we had before had led us down a path of distance and disconnect. Instead, we focused on creating something new, something stronger. We made a point to do things together again, things that brought us joy and helped us reconnect outside of the seriousness of therapy and rebuilding trust. We started hiking on the weekends, going for long walks in the woods like we used to when we first met. There was something about being in nature that helped us clear our minds, that gave us the space to just be ourselves again. One Saturday, while we were hiking along a trail that overlooked a beautiful valley, Megan stopped suddenly, turning to face me. She was smiling, but there was something deeper in her eyes, something she had been holding on to. You know, she began, her voice soft. I think the best part about all of this, if there is a best part, is that we're learning to see each other in a new way. I don't just see you as my husband anymore. I see you as someone who's evolving, just like me. We're not perfect, but we're trying. And that's enough for me. Her words struck me in a way I hadn't expected. I realized she was right, we were evolving. The version of me that had hurt her, and the version of her that had betrayed me, weren't who we were anymore. We were growing, changing, becoming people who could truly love and understand each other in ways we hadn't before. I feel the same way, I replied, taking her hand. We're not the same people we were a year ago, and I'm okay with that. I think it's making us stronger. We stood there for a long time, just holding each other, looking out at the endless horizon. It was a quiet moment, but in it, I felt something shift between us. A deeper sense of connection, like we were truly in this together. As the emotional healing continued, the physical part of our relationship slowly began to bloom again. It hadn't been easy at first. There were still moments when one of us would pull back, the memories of our mistakes making intimacy feel complicated and fraught with unspoken fears. But the more we talked, the more we allowed ourselves to be vulnerable with each other, the more we began to trust our bodies again. One evening, after a long day at work, Megan came home in one of her favorite dresses, the one I always loved, the soft blue one that hugged her body just right. She had her hair down, and she looked stunning in a way that felt almost effortless. When she walked into the kitchen where I was making dinner, I could tell by the look in her eyes that something had shifted. Without saying a word, she walked over to me, wrapping her arms around my waist from behind, resting her chin on my shoulder. "I've missed this," she whispered softly. "I've missed us." I turned around to face her, and there was a heat in her gaze that I hadn't seen in a long time. Slowly, I brushed a strand of hair from her face, my fingers lingering against her skin. It had been so long since we had let ourselves truly desire each other, without the guilt, without the hesitation. "I've missed this too," I replied, my voice low. "I've missed you." There was no rush in that moment, no frantic need to prove anything. It was just us, finally letting go of the barriers we had built between us, letting the desire we had buried for so long rise to the surface again. Megan leaned in, her lips brushing against mine, and it felt like the first time all over again, like we were rediscovering each other, learning what it meant to be close, not just physically but emotionally. That night, we made love for the first time in what felt like forever. It wasn't about erasing the past or pretending the hurt hadn't happened. It was about reclaiming the connection we had lost, about finding our way back to each other in the most intimate way possible. Afterward, as we lay together in the quiet of our bedroom, her head resting on my chest, I felt a sense of peace that I hadn't felt in a long time. This was what we had fought for, this closeness, this vulnerability, this love. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours, and that made it worth everything we had been through. In the months that followed, Megan and I found ourselves laughing more. It was something I hadn't even realized had been missing until it returned. We started sharing inside jokes again, teasing each other in that playful way that had always been a part of our relationship before everything went wrong. It felt like we were finally coming out of the darkness, and in its place, There was light. One weekend, we decided to take a spontaneous trip to the beach, a place we hadn't visited since before the affair. It had always been one of our favorite spots, a place where we could unwind, reconnect with nature, and just enjoy each other's company. As we drove down the coastal highway, with the sun shining and the windows rolled down, it felt like the weight of the last year was lifting. When we arrived at the beach, we walked along the shore, hand in hand, letting the cool water lap at our feet. Megan looked over at me, her eyes sparkling with that mischievous glint I had fallen in love with all those years ago. "Race you to the water," she said, grinning before taking off in a sprint toward the ocean. I laughed, chasing after her, feeling like a kid again. By the time I caught up, she was already waist-deep in the water, splashing me playfully. We spent the rest of the afternoon swimming, laughing, and just being carefree in a way we hadn't been in so long. That night, as we sat by a small bonfire on the beach, watching the waves roll in, Megan leaned her head on my shoulder, and I realized just how far we had come. We had been through hell and back, but somehow we had made it. We had rediscovered the joy in each other, the simple pleasure of being together. "I'm really glad we didn't give up," Megan said quietly, her voice barely audible over the crackling fire. "Me too," I replied, pulling her closer. "We've got something worth fighting for." As the year drew to a close, Megan and I found ourselves in a place we never thought we'd be. Stronger, more connected, and more in love than ever before. It wasn't that we had forgotten what had happened or that the scars of our betrayal had disappeared. They were still there, reminders of how fragile love can be. But those scars also reminded us of how far we had come, of the work we had put in to rebuild our marriage. We started talking more seriously about the future, about kids, about the life we wanted to build together. For so long, the idea of a future had seemed distant, something we weren't ready for. But now it felt like we were ready. We had faced our darkest moments, and we had come out the other side stronger. One evening, as we sat together on the porch, watching the sun set over the horizon, Megan turned to me, a soft smile on her lips. "Do you think we're ready?" she asked, her hand resting gently on her stomach, a small, tentative gesture that hinted at the conversation we'd been having for weeks. I smiled back at her, feeling a sense of peace and certainty I hadn't felt in a long time. "I think we are. I think we've been through enough to know that whatever comes next, we can handle it. Together. Our story isn't over, it never will be. Megan and I are still learning, still growing, still figuring out how to navigate this crazy, complicated thing called marriage. But one thing is certain, we're in this for the long haul. We've learned that love isn't about perfection. It's about showing up every day, even when it's hard. It's about being vulnerable, being honest, and being willing to do the work. And most importantly, it's about choosing each other over and over again. As I sit here now, watching Megan laugh at something on TV, her eyes crinkling at the corners in that way they always do, I feel a sense of gratitude. We've been through hell and back, but we're still here, still laughing, still loving, still fighting for each other. And I wouldn't have it any other way. The decision to start a family didn't come easily. Even though we had worked so hard to rebuild our relationship, the thought of bringing a child into the world brought new anxieties, new uncertainties. It wasn't just about us anymore. It was about the life we would create together. And that thought was both exhilarating and terrifying. One night, as Megan and I lay in bed, the room dimly lit by the moonlight streaming through the curtains, she turned to me with a look of quiet determination. "I've been thinking about it a lot," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper. "I think I'm ready." I looked at her, searching her face for any sign of doubt. But there wasn't any. This wasn't the same uncertainty we had faced a year ago. This was something deeper, a quiet confidence in the future we had fought so hard to protect. "Are you sure?" I asked, my voice equally soft. "We don't have to rush into anything. We've got time." Megan smiled, reaching out to take my hand, her fingers warm against mine. "I know, but I don't want to wait anymore. I feel like we've been through so much, and now I'm ready to move forward, to build something new." I nodded, feeling the same quiet excitement bubbling up inside me. The idea of becoming parents, of starting a family, was something we had talked about in the past, but it had always felt distant, something for later. Now, though, it felt real, tangible, like the next step in our journey together. "Then let's do it," I said, squeezing her hand. "Let's start a family." Once we made the decision, things moved quickly. Megan and I started preparing for this new chapter in our lives, reading books, talking to friends who already had kids, and adjusting our lifestyle in small but meaningful ways. We cleared out the spare bedroom, turning it into a nursery. Every little step felt monumental, like we were creating a space for something or someone who would change our lives forever. The anticipation was exhilarating. There was so much hope, so much joy, wrapped up in the idea of becoming parents. But there were also moments of doubt. Late at night, when the house was quiet and Megan had already fallen asleep beside me, I would lie awake, thinking about the kind of father I would be. Would I be good enough? Would I be able to protect our child from the mistakes I had made in my own life? One evening, I shared these thoughts with Megan as we sat on the couch, the warmth of the fireplace flickering in the background. She listened patiently, her head resting on my shoulder. "I don't think anyone ever feels fully ready," she said, her voice calm and steady. "But I know you're going to be an amazing father. We're going to figure this out together, just like we've figured everything else out." Her words gave me comfort, as they always did. Megan had a way of grounding me, of reminding me that I didn't have to have all the answers right away. Parenthood, like marriage, would be something we'd navigate one step at a time. A few months later, we were sitting in the living room when Megan suddenly appeared in the doorway, her face pale and her hands trembling slightly. She was holding something behind her back, and my heart skipped a beat. I knew what was coming, or at least I hoped I did. "Ben," she started, her voice shaking slightly, "I have something to show you." She slowly pulled her hand from behind her back, revealing a small plastic stick, one of the pregnancy tests we had bought weeks ago. I didn't even need to look at the result. The look on her face said it all. "We're pregnant," she whispered, her eyes welling up with tears. For a moment I was frozen. I stared at her, at the test, and then back at her again, feeling like the world had just shifted beneath my feet. And then, before I knew it, I was pulling her into my arms, holding her tightly as the reality of the moment sank in. "We're going to be parents," I whispered into her hair, my voice thick with emotion. Megan pulled back slightly, tears streaming down her face, but her smile was radiant, filled with joy and hope. "Yeah," she said softly, nodding. "We're going to be parents." The next several months were a whirlwind of emotions, excitement, and preparations. As Megan's belly grew, so did the love we felt for the life developing inside her. Every ultrasound, every kick, every moment was filled with wonder and awe. We had created something together, something beautiful, and the anticipation of meeting our child was almost overwhelming. But there were also challenges. Pregnancy wasn't easy, especially as Megan neared the final months. There were days when she was exhausted, when her body ached, and I could see the toll it was taking on her. I did everything I could to make things easier, cooking, cleaning, and rubbing her feet after long days. But I knew there was only so much I could do. The rest was up to her. "I feel like a whale," she said one evening, lying on the couch with her feet propped up, her hand resting on her swollen belly. I chuckled, sitting down beside her and brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You're beautiful," I said, kissing her forehead. "And you're growing our baby. That makes you the most amazing person in the world." Megan smiled, though I could see the exhaustion in her eyes. "I just want to meet them already. I feel like we've been waiting forever." "It'll be soon," I promised. "Just a little longer." When the day finally came, it was like nothing I had ever experienced before. Megan's contractions started early in the morning, and by the time we got to the hospital, things were moving quickly. I stayed by her side the entire time, holding her hand, whispering words of encouragement, though I could see the pain and exhaustion etched on her face. "You're doing amazing," I kept telling her, though I knew it didn't make the pain any easier. "Just a little longer." Hours later, when the baby's cries filled the room, I felt a rush of emotion so powerful that I could barely breathe. Megan looked up at me, her face damp with sweat, but her eyes were filled with joy and relief. "It's a girl," the nurse said, placing the tiny, squirming bundle in Megan's arms. I stared down at our daughter, my heart swelling with love and awe. She was perfect, so small and fragile, but so full of life. Megan looked up at me, tears streaming down her face as she held our baby girl close. "We did it," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "We made it." I leaned down, kissing her softly, feeling a sense of peace and fulfillment that I had never known before. "Yeah," I whispered back, my voice cracking. "We did it." Bringing our daughter home was a surreal experience. Suddenly, the house that had once felt so familiar now felt different, filled with the sounds of a newborn's cries, the scent of baby lotion, and the endless shuffle of diaper changes and feedings. It was exhausting in a way I hadn't expected, but it was also beautiful. Megan and I quickly fell into a rhythm, working as a team to navigate the sleepless nights and endless feedings. There were moments when we were so tired we could barely function, but every time I looked at our daughter, I knew it was all worth it. One night, as I rocked our baby girl to sleep, Megan came up behind me, wrapping her arms around my waist and resting her chin on my shoulder. "You're a natural," she whispered, watching me gently sway back and forth with our daughter in my arms. I smiled, feeling a deep sense of pride. "I'm just trying not to mess it up." Megan chuckled softly, leaning her head against me. "You won't. You're an amazing father." Her words filled me with a warmth that I couldn't quite describe. I wasn't perfect. None of this was, but we were doing it, together, and that was enough. As the weeks turned into months, Megan and I found ourselves rediscovering each other in the midst of our new roles as parents. It wasn't easy. There were days when we barely had time to talk, when we were so consumed by the demands of caring for our daughter that we forgot to care for ourselves. But through it all, we stayed connected. One evening, after we had finally gotten our daughter to sleep, Megan and I sat on the couch, sharing a glass of wine. It was one of the first quiet moments we had had in what felt like forever. "You know," she said, looking over at me with a soft smile, "I think we've come a long way." I nodded, reaching out to take her hand. "We really have." She leaned her head against my shoulder, and for a moment, we just sat there in the quiet, enjoying the peace that came with knowing we had made it through the hardest parts of our journey. "I'm proud of us," Megan said softly, her voice full of warmth. "We didn't give up, and now look at us. We've got a beautiful daughter, and we're stronger than ever." I kissed the top of her head, feeling a deep sense of gratitude for everything we had been through. "I'm proud of us too," I whispered, "and I love you more now than I ever have." Megan smiled, her eyes shining with emotion. "I love you too, Ben, and I'm so glad we fought for this, for us." As our daughter grew, so did our love for each other and for the life we had built together. The challenges didn't stop. Parenthood was full of ups and downs, sleepless nights and stressful days. But through it all, we faced it together. We had learned, through everything, that love wasn't about perfection. It was about persistence, about choosing each other every single day, even when things were hard. Megan and I still had our moments of doubt, our moments of fear, but those moments were no longer what defined us. What defined us now was the quiet strength we had found in each other, the commitment we had made to keep moving forward, no matter what. And as I watched our daughter grow, as I saw the joy in Megan's eyes when she looked at her, I knew that we had built something beautiful, something real. Our story wasn't over, not by a long shot. But now, as we faced the future, I knew that whatever came next, we would face it together. And that was all I needed. The years rolled by, and with them came the natural ebb and flow of life. Our daughter grew, and so did our family. Parenthood brought its own set of challenges, but also immeasurable joy. Megan and I weren't just surviving anymore, we were thriving. We had found a balance, a way to be both parents and partners, supporting each other through the ups and downs of life. Our marriage, once on the brink of collapse, had become stronger than I ever could have imagined. We still had our moments. There were disagreements about parenting, Long nights when neither of us got any sleep, and times when stress got the better of us. But these were the normal struggles of life, nothing compared to the darkness we had faced before. The trust between us, hard-earned and tested, had become our foundation. And the love we had for each other, deepened by our shared experiences, continued to grow. One evening, years later, I found myself standing on our back porch, watching our daughter run around the yard, chasing bubbles Megan was blowing. The setting sun cast a golden glow over everything, and the sound of our daughter's laughter filled the air. It was one of those perfect moments, the kind that sneaks up on you when you're not paying attention. It wasn't grand or dramatic, just the simple beauty of family life. Megan came up beside me, her hands slipping into mine as we watched our little girl play. I glanced over at her, and the years seemed to melt away. She was as beautiful as ever, her face softened by the golden light, her smile easy and content. We stood there in silence for a while, just soaking in the moment. "I still can't believe how far we've come," I said quietly, my voice filled with awe and gratitude. Megan smiled, leaning her head on my shoulder. "I know. Sometimes it feels like a lifetime ago. Doesn't it?" "Yeah," I nodded, squeezing her hand. "But I wouldn't change a thing. Not even the hard parts." She looked up at me, her eyes filled with that same warmth and love I had seen so many times before. "Me neither," she whispered. "It made us who we are." We stood there for a long time, just watching our daughter, lost in our thoughts. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the yard, and as the day slowly faded, I felt a deep sense of peace settle over me. Life hadn't turned out the way I had expected, but it had turned out exactly as it was meant to. Years later, I found myself reflecting on everything we had been through. The affair, the betrayal, the heartbreak. Those were parts of our story, but they weren't the whole story. They were chapters in a much longer, more complicated book. A book about love, about forgiveness, about second chances. Megan and I had built a life together that was full of love, full of laughter, and full of those small, quiet moments that made everything worth it. We had raised a beautiful daughter, and we had shown her what it meant to love someone unconditionally, to fight for what matters, and to never give up, even when things seemed hopeless. Our marriage wasn't perfect, no marriage ever is, but it was real, and that was all I ever wanted. As we grew older, Megan and I continued to lean on each other, to support each other through the inevitable changes that life brought. We faced new challenges. Aging parents, career shifts, our daughter growing up and moving out into the world. But through it all, we stayed strong, because we had learned the most important lesson of all. That love isn't about never making mistakes. It's about what you do after those mistakes are made. It's about forgiveness. It's about growth. And most of all, it's about choosing each other every single day. Years later, long after our daughter had grown up and started her own family, Megan and I found ourselves sitting together on the same back porch where we had spent so many evenings. The yard was quiet now, the echoes of our daughter's laughter replaced by the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. But the peace I felt was the same. Megan's hair had turned silver, and there were more wrinkles around her eyes. But to me, she was more beautiful than ever. We had grown old together, and in doing so, we had built a lifetime of memories, a legacy of love that stretched beyond the mistakes we had once made. I looked over at her, taking her hand in mine, and she smiled at me. That same soft smile that had carried us through so much. "We've had a good life, haven't we?" she said quietly, her voice filled with contentment. I nodded, feeling the weight of everything we had been through, the good, the bad, and everything in between. "Yeah," I replied, my voice thick with emotion. "We really have." As we sat there in the fading light, the years stretching out behind us, I realized that this was the true ending to our story. Not the affairs, not the pain, but the love that had grown stronger because of it all. We had chosen each other time and time again, and in doing so, we had built something beautiful. And that was all that mattered. Megan passed away quietly one autumn morning, many years later, her hand in mine as she took her final breath. It was peaceful, the end of a long, full life lived with love and grace. In that moment, As I held her, I felt the weight of our shared history, the years we had spent building a life together, and I knew that even though she was gone, the love we had created would live on. Our daughter, now grown with children of her own, sat with me in the days that followed, and as we shared stories about Megan, about her kindness, her strength, her fierce love, I realized that her legacy wasn't just in the life we had built together. It was in the lessons we had taught our daughter, in the love she had carried forward into her own family. Megan and I had made mistakes. We had hurt each other. But in the end, we had chosen love. And that choice had shaped not just our lives, but the lives of those we loved. Sitting on that porch, alone for the first time in decades, I thought about everything we had been through, and I smiled. Because even though Megan was gone, the love we had shared still surrounded me. It always would. And in that, I found peace.